favorite character in the Bible, and that is Joseph. Now, his story can be found in Genesis chapter 37 through Genesis 50. Now, his story takes up 14 chapters in our Bibles. And so that is a lengthy amount of scriptures. So I will be paraphrasing more than normal this morning. I would like for us to look at the story of Joseph, looking at the big picture, but at the same time, I want to emphasize 3 critical points to you that we can learn from Joseph's story. Through the years, his story has given me great strength, comfort, wisdom, and direction, and I hope that it will do the same for you here this morning. Now, 25 years ago, I memorized the story from the New King James Version. And I know that normally we share from the ESV version, and I started to look at that, but it was too confusing for me. So I'm going to ask you, if you're used to the ESV, if you would please join with me this morning as I will be reading from the New King James, and that is what is going to be behind me. So the first thing that we need to know about Joseph is that he was born into a dysfunctional family. Now, I recognize here I am at Calvary Assembly where no perfect people, no perfect families are allowed. And perhaps this morning you can relate. Perhaps you were born into great dysfunction. If you can relate, just raise your hand. Unless your parents are here with you, then I understand. So one thing we need to know about Joseph, and like I said, his story starts out in Genesis 37. But before we get to Genesis 37, we look at the previous chapters, and it tells us about Joseph's family and the dysfunction he was born into. So Joseph's father, Jacob, loved Rachel. Now, it was love at first sight. When he saw her, he was willing to work 7 years to pay the dowry, to pay the bride price to marry her. But her father tricked Jacob, and so he married Leah, the older sister, first, and then he had to work another 7 years to ultimately get the bride Rachel that he wanted. And the crazy thing is that scripture tells us that these 14 years of hard labor seemed like days to him because he loved Rachel so much. And I know you're thinking right now as I'm sharing this with you that it sounds like a reality TV show, right? Sister Wives. But in fact, this really is in your Bible. So Jacob had these 2 sisters, and he was married to both of them. And so the one, Rachel, whom he loved, was barren for a season. And then the older, Leah, who he rejected, when God saw that she was unloved, he opened her womb and blessed her with 10 boys. Because in that time period, in that culture, if you had sons, you were considered to be highly favored and blessed of God. And so eventually Rachel conceived and had 2 sons, her oldest being Joseph. And then later, when she was giving birth to her second son, Benjamin, she actually died in childbirth. And so this was a dysfunction that Joseph was born into, the constant strife and the fighting between his mother and his aunt. And then his aunt's sons, his 10 half-brothers, were constantly jealous of Joseph. Now, I have to tell you, Joseph did not make the situation easier because the Bible tells us that he was a tattletale. Now, again, I'm going to be paraphrasing this for time, but I do want to read to you from Genesis 37, verses 3 through 5. It says, "Now Jacob loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age." He was the baby. "Also, he made him a tunic, a robe, or a coat of many colors. But his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more." Now I'm going to ask you another question. How many of you can relate to that? Maybe there is a younger sibling in your family that was kind of spoiled, that was kind of the favorite, that was also a tattletale. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand on that because they might be here with you this morning. But Joseph, when he was 17 years old, he had a dream. Now, this was a prophetic dream given to him by God that revealed the plan and the purpose that God had for Joseph's life. And so one day, Jacob sent his son Joseph to the field to check on his 10 half-brothers who were away from home, tending to flock in the valley. And the Bible tells us that when the brothers saw Joseph far off in a distance, they conspired to kill him. In fact, Genesis 37, verses 19 and 20, it says, "Then they said to one another, 'Look, this dreamer is coming. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit. We shall say that some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams.'" So they hated him, and they did not want to see the dream, the plan that God had for his life come to pass. So they ripped the coat of many colors off of him, and they threw him into a pit, and they sat down to eat and drink as Joseph was crying in the pit. And just at that time, as they looked up, they saw a group of Ishmaelites passing through. Now, they were on their way to buy and trade in Egypt. And so they sold their brother to these traders. Now, today, we would call this human trafficking. This is the definition of human trafficking. It means the action or practice of illegally transporting people from one country to another, typically for the purposes of forced labor or sexual exploitation. And so his brothers sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, who carried him away from his homeland where they were staying at the time, the land of Canaan. And the Ishmaelites took him into another country, Egypt, and sold him there for forced labor. And so the brothers took the coat of many colors and dipped it in animal's blood and returned to their father Jacob and said, "Surely Joseph must be dead." And so Joseph is sold to Potiphar, who was actually an officer of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh was the king, the ruler, or the emperor of Egypt at the time. And so Joseph, who had one time dreamed of greatness when he was a teenager, he was excited about the plan that God had for himself, now finds himself as a slave. I'm sure he must have thought, how hard would it be for God's plan to come to pass in his life? How could he be someone great that people would bow down to if he was a slave? And Genesis 39, 2-5 tells us something very interesting. It said that the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was from the time that he made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. And this is actually a pattern we see in chapters 37-50, that God touched Joseph's life, that it was undeniable. Whoever saw Joseph could see that the favor of God was on Joseph, and that everything he did prospered and was successful. Now, the Bible tells us that Potiphar's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph because he was handsome in form and appearance. And she said to Joseph, "Come lie with me." But Joseph responded to her, and we see this response in Genesis chapter 39, verse 9, which tells us that he was a man of great faith, because this is his response. He said, "There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has Potiphar, my boss, your husband, kept anything back from me but you, because you are his wife." Then Joseph said, "How then can I do this wickedness and sin against God?" Now, if I was in Joseph's shoes, I'm not sure that I would be able to have that kind of response, because I think it's easy for us to see how Joseph could have felt differently. How Joseph could have easily said, "If there is a God in heaven, then where was he when my mother died? If there was a God in heaven, then where was he when I was abused and mistreated and sold by my own brothers?" But instead, Joseph chose to believe. Instead, he responded in faith. He chose to believe there was a God in heaven watching and in control, and he refused to sin against God. Now, this is my first point, because I believe it is actually something in our journey, in our walk with God, that we must all come to a place to. We must all come to a place where we resolve this one thing in our journey, and that is this: where was God when blank happened to me? And you fill in the blank. Where was God when I experienced that great loss? Where was God when I was mistreated? Where was God when my child was wounded or sick? Now, you see, the Bible tells us that God created us from the dust of the earth, and he breathed his spirit in us. Now, our spirit is indestructible. It's unbreakable. Our flesh will die, but our spirit will live forever. Our spirit will spend an eternity in heaven with Jesus, or an eternity in hell away from Jesus. That in this spirit, God gave us the beautiful gift of free will. He gave us the gift to be able to choose. And we can wake up one day and we can choose sin. We can wake up one day and we can choose not to sin. We can wake up one day and we can obey God. We could choose to disobey him. We can choose life, or we can choose death. And I don't know that we realize the great gift of free will, of choice that God has given us, and how powerful that gift is. In fact, God is so committed to free will that he will not violate it. When a person chooses to do something, he will not override their choice or force his will on anybody, even though people choose to do evil things to harm themselves or harm others. Students, if you're here this morning and you hear anything I say at all, and this applies to everybody, but I want our students to pay attention. If you will line your free will choice up with God's plan for your life, if you will choose to apply his principles to your life, there is a power that you can tap into. And when you do that, no attack from the enemy, anything anyone does to you can keep the plan of God from coming to pass in your life. Students, if you will hear this, some of you are growing up in homes where your parents are first-generation Christians. Maybe both of them. Maybe your mom and your dad, or maybe just one of them is a first-generation Christian. And that may not mean a lot to you now, but when you are older and you have children of your own, you will appreciate that more. Because to be a first-generation Christian, what that means is that you grew up in dysfunction. You grew up under generational curses. And when you gave your life to Jesus for the first time, you drew the bloodline and you fought hell so that your parents, so that your children could know what it was like to not grow up under the curse, but to grow up under generational blessings. And I say this to our students. If that's the case, if your parents are first generation Christians, and they have fought to redeem things, to take things out from under the curse and put it under the blessing. How dare you young people, if this is you, that you would flirt with sin, that you would look at temptation and risk taking your future seed, your bloodline, and dragging it from the blessing and putting it back under the curse. So Joseph refused to sin. He refused to sin with his boss's wife. And so she lied and accused him of attempted rape. And so Joseph is now put in prison for something he did not do. But like I said, the pattern for Joseph is that no matter where he went, no matter what happened to him, God's hand was on him, God blessed him, and God prospered him. So even there in the prison, it was so clear to see that God's hand was blessing him. And so they put him in charge of the prison, and he ran the prison. And so for 5 years, as Joseph is running the prison, one day, the Pharaoh's chief butler and baker come into the prison. And they have dreams. And because Joseph had this prophetic anointing on his life, not just for him to dream dreams of the future, but for him also to interpret dreams that others received that were from God. So Joseph was able to interpret the dreams of the butler and the baker. And so he says to the baker, this is what your dream means. 3 days from now, you are going to be killed. But then he says to the butler, 3 days from now, you are going to be restored back to your position, serving the king, serving Pharaoh once again. And he says to the butler in Genesis chapter 40, verses 14 and 15, but remember me when it is well with you, and please show me kindness. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house, for indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews. And also, I have done nothing wrong that they should have put me here in this dungeon. And so this is my opinion of what was happening at the time, and I will preface this and tell you this is my opinion. I believe Joseph was probably in his darkest hour at this time. He was now in prison for 5 years. Before that, he worked as a slave. He was probably beginning to doubt as all these years went by. He was probably questioning and saying, God, do you still remember me? And so Joseph begins to take matters into his own hands, and he begins to plead his case with the butler. And you might be here this morning, and maybe God gave you a dream, a vision, a future, a hope for your life 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 years ago. And now you're in your darkest hour in the dungeon as a slave, wondering, God, did you forget about me? Is that dream you gave me ever going to come to pass? And so here is the second thing that you need to resolve in your walk with God. The second point I want to make this morning, that there are some things in your life that only God can change. And you need to be able to recognize what those things are, or you are going to be frustrated trying to change them yourself. And so the butler is restored to his royal position 3 days after his dream, just as Joseph prophesied, only he forgets all about Joseph. Until 2 years later, Pharaoh has a dream, and no one is able to interpret the dream. And at this time, the butler remembers Joseph, and he makes mention of Joseph to Pharaoh. And so Joseph is brought up and stands before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tells the dream. And Joseph interprets the dream encouraging the Pharaoh, saying, God has revealed the future to you. God is showing you what he wants to do in the future. There is going to be 7 years of plenty, of prosperity, of much food. But then when that 7 years is up, there is going to be 7 years of famine and want and lack and need. And then Joseph went on to make this recommendation. He said to the Pharaoh, since God has revealed this to you, God has spoken to you through this dream, I encourage you, during the 7 years of plenty, take some of that seed and put it in a storehouse so that when the famine comes, you will have food to survive. And so the Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of this great idea. And he now gives Joseph a part in the palace. He now gives Joseph his signet ring. He now gives him full authority in the land of Egypt. The only person that Joseph has to answer to at any time is Pharaoh himself. In fact, the Pharaoh even blesses him with a wife. And so Joseph is in his new position. God is beginning to restore his life. And the 7 years of plenty happen, just as he had said. And they're setting food aside. And then the famine comes. Now they're 2 years into this famine in Egypt, but the famine is so bad that it's actually a worldwide famine. It's actually beyond the borders of Egypt. And so now not only are the people in Egypt appearing before Joseph and buying the grain that he had set back, but now other people that don't even live in Egypt are coming and bowing before Joseph and begging if they can buy some grain and some food to live. And so now one day, Joseph is 41 years old. He's 41 years old. Now remember, when he originally had the dream, he was 17. So roughly 24 years have passed, and his brothers are in need of food. And they come to the throne, and they bow down before him. And he immediately recognizes them. However, they did not recognize him. So he spoke to them with an interpreter so that they would still not know who he was. And throughout different times of the story, we see that he cries in anguish, that he has all these emotions, that he sees them and he remembers his past. He remembered what they did to him. He remembers the pain. And this part of the story illustrates so well in a literal sense, but it's also symbolic of what happens when we hold on to unforgiveness. Because Joseph, at first seeing them, is angry and throws them all in prison. Matthew 18, verse 35, and Mark 11, verse 26, Jesus is telling a story. And Jesus himself says, here in this life, you must forgive people that sin against you. If you do not do that, then your Father in heaven will not forgive you. And when you do a study of that word forgive in its original Greek language, it means to send away, to let go, to release, to leave alone, to permit to depart. So if you refuse to forgive, then you're refusing to let something go. You're refusing to send it away. You're refusing to have it depart. You're keeping it close to you. That offense, that thing that you don't want to forgive. And so I have an illustration this morning, what it looks like when we refuse to forgive someone. You see, when someone does us wrong and we refuse to forgive them, like Joseph put his brothers in a literal prison. He bound them up and chained them. So when we refuse to release something, when we want that person, just as Joseph wanted his brothers to pay for what they did to him. Initially, he wanted his brothers to know what it was like to be in prison. So someone that we refuse to forgive, we want to chain them up. We want to punish them for what they did. We want them to know the same pain that we experienced. And we think that we're hurting them, but what we don't realize is that we're hurting ourselves. Because when we refuse to forgive, we are binding ourselves to that person. So we are bound to that person that we refuse to forgive. We refuse to let them go. We hang on to the hurt, thinking that we are hurting them. But what we don't realize is we are hurting ourselves. Because as long as we have that unforgiveness, we are tied to them. And that thing that we're so mad at them about could have happened many years ago. But time won't untie us from them. We can move across the country, but miles in distance won't untie us as long as we still have unforgiveness in our heart. And so now everything I am, everything I do is affected by all this weight that I'm carrying, this weight of unforgiveness. And so I want to be a better parent, but I'm kind of hindered because I'm carrying all this weight because I'm still upset about how I was treated as a child. And so I want to be a better spouse, but I'm carrying around all this baggage from a previous relationship. I haven't forgiven someone in my past. And so now in my new relationship, this third person that I'm carrying around that I refuse to forgive is right in the middle of my new relationship. And I can't imagine what it would have been like for Joseph if he had refused to forgive, if he had hung on to that, if he sought revenge for his 10 brothers. What would that have been like, carrying around all that baggage and weight of unforgiveness towards 10 people in his life? I imagine it would have looked like this, that he would have said to others that he was pleading his case with, but my brothers did this, and then my boss's wife did this, and it's not fair. I shouldn't even be here in Egypt. I shouldn't be in this prison. And so this morning, you might be here, and you don't realize you're carrying this extra weight. Because of forgiveness, because of things you won't release, because of people you won't release. And I imagine for Joseph, he was sitting there thinking, how do you forgive someone that sold you for money? How do you forgive someone? But you forgive someone, whether they deserve it or not. You leave them in the hands of God. You forgive them for you. You forgive them for you. Because you want to be free of the baggage. You want to be free of all the weight. And only you can choose that. It's a free will choice. Only you hold the key. And that key is forgiveness. And so now I've forgiven that person, not for them, but for me, because it frees me. And I want to move on to see the plan that God has for my life. I don't want to carry all this extra weight. And for some of you, as you get a little bit closer, you realize that that person you've been beating up and dragging around all these years is you. You can't have peace with yourself. You can't sleep at night because you haven't forgiven yourself. You can't be your own greatest cheerleader and move on and encourage yourself and see what God has for you because you keep blaming yourself. You are your own worst enemy. And it's time this morning to forgive yourself. And so Joseph makes the free will choice that is so hard to do. Even though we read about his pain and his anguish and his tears that he held back. And then other times he went into a room and he cried alone. And I know some of you have spent hours and days alone crying because of the pain. But Joseph chose. He made a free will choice. He chose. And on the third day, Genesis 42:18 says, on the third day, he went down to that prison and he said to his brothers, do this and live because I fear God. In other words, Joseph made a choice. With his free will, he chose to obey the principles of God in his life. He chose to obey the voice of God in his life that was telling him to forgive. And though his flesh, though his emotions may not have felt like it, sometimes we have to do like the great apostle Paul says, we have to beat our flesh into subjection. Sometimes we have to say, I choose to do God's will, and my body, my emotions, my flesh is going to line up with what I choose to do. And so Joseph released all 9 brothers that day to be free. He kept one there as a guarantee because he still desired to see Benjamin, his full brother. And so while the 9 left to get Benjamin, when they return with Benjamin, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And he says, I am he. I'm the one that you sold as a slave into this land of Egypt. And then Joseph was ultimately reunited not just with his full brother Benjamin, but with his father who was still alive. They all come to Egypt, and Joseph provides for all of them. Even his 10 half-brothers, after what they did, he provides for them out of his own resources. Until Joseph's father finally passes, he dies. And the 10 half-brothers come. And they think to themselves, surely now Joseph is going to revenge and pay us back for what we did. So they humbly go to Joseph and they say, look, you know, when Dad was around, he would have wanted us all to get along. And Joseph says to them in Genesis 50 verses 19 and 20, am I in the place of God? You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. You see, Joseph came to a place where he was older and he was wiser, and he was no longer thinking, if my brothers hadn't have done this, if my boss's wife hadn't have done this. But he said, no, you know what? I forgive them. God allowed all of this for his greater plan and purpose. And that shows us that no matter what happens to us, no matter what happens to me, no matter what happens to you, that it cannot stop the plan of God from coming to pass in your life if you choose to work with God and apply those principles to your life. Oftentimes I wonder, would this story have had the same outcome if Joseph refused to forgive? I want you to close your eyes and bow your heads as we have a moment of prayer together this morning. Maybe you're here and you're somewhere in your journey